How's it going, everyone? CJ here. Mohnish Pabrai just gave a talk to the students at Indiana University where he talked about 3 new mental models that he just added to his investing checklist. I want to talk about each one of these mental models, and then I want to talk about some general practical investing tips that Pabrai also gave in his talk. Okay, let's dig into it. The first mental model I want to talk about is what I'll call the Cinch Model. Pabrai was talking about how he recently had dinner with Charlie Munger, and this is actually a mental model that he picked up from Charlie. Charlie is always saying, I think that X company is a cinch or Y company is not a cinch at all. What he means by this is, what are the chances that another company or some external forces are going to take away the competitive advantages or eat away at the moat of that company? So if a company is a cinch, no matter how much competition there might be, their moat is going to stay intact. They're going to avoid destruction more easily than every other company out there. For instance, Charlie gave the example of American Express. Today, he says American Express is not a cinch. However, 20 years ago, he definitely would have said American Express was a cinch. Now, that's not to say that American Express isn't a great business today with a durable moat. However, we have to ask the question, what will happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What will American Express's business look like? There's a bunch of competition in the digital payment space that really could eat into American Express's moat. One of the most important factors to consider when evaluating a business's prospects is the durability of that competitive advantage. And just because a company right now, for all intents and purposes, seems like it has an indestructible, durable competitive advantage, it doesn't mean that 10 to 20 years from now, that advantage will still be intact. And that's one of the main difficulties of investing in general. Capitalism is absolutely brutal. Somebody's going to come in and eat your lunch if there's an opportunity to make money. And that's one of the biggest reasons why it's so hard to predict the future of businesses. And with Pabrai's new approach to only investing in long-term compounders, you have to be extremely certain of the cinch of the business that you're looking at. He said you need to have a fanatical focus on the competitive advantage of the business that you're evaluating. And of course, with this mental model, it really raises the standard of the bar at which you are looking at companies. If you're planning on holding a business as long as possible, like Pabrai is starting to do, then you need to be as close to certain as possible, or know that the business is basically going to be a cinch. Again, it sets a really high bar for the types of businesses that you're going to invest in, and it really shrinks the investable universe of stocks. So imagine Warren and Charlie sitting there with billions of dollars of cash looking for investments, and they have this huge bar for cinches. Well, no wonder why they don't make investments very often. There just aren't that many opportunities. I do remember Charlie talking about Berkshire's investment in Apple at one point. I think it was at a Daily Journal company annual meeting a few years back, and he was saying that Apple actually wasn't a cinch. They just felt like they had a little bit more insight than the rest of the investors investing in Apple. So it's not necessarily a requirement for Charlie and Warren at Berkshire to invest in a cinch. They just feel like they need to have an advantage of analysis over others. Luckily for Pabrai, he runs a much smaller fund than Berkshire Hathaway, so he's still finding opportunities. In fact, he mentioned that he has 2 cinches in his portfolio already. Based on what I can gather from his recent talks, I think he's referring to his investments in Valuations and Cinch. As he's discussed previously, he is trying to transition his entire portfolio over one from good, cheap businesses to wonderful long-term compounders. Let me know in the comments below if you think he's talking about any other businesses besides Cinch or Valuations. So because capitalism is so brutal and most businesses will die even if they're strong today, the Cinch model helps you try to narrow down your universe of stocks in order to figure out what types of businesses we truly want to invest in. If we think that a business is a cinch, that'll go a long way in helping us evaluate a company's prospects. Next up is the feet on the desk tendency. Mohnish learned about this mental model in context of American Tower. Now, American Tower is a company that owns a lot of wireless communication cell towers and then leases those out to communications companies and wireless service providers. Pabrai knew an analyst that was going to speak to the leadership of American Tower, and when the analyst arrived, the CEO basically had his feet up on his desk. And the analyst was just flabbergasted. He didn't understand why the CEO basically didn't have any work to do. We want to invest in businesses where the CEO can have his feet up on his desk. The powerful thing about American Tower's business is that the customers come to them. Companies that want to sell these wireless towers have the phone number for American Tower, and American Tower knows exactly what price they'll pay to acquire towers like this. So what more could you want from a company where the customers come to you and you know right up front what you're going to pay for a tower, and if not, then you just move on. There's not much work involved at this point. Pabrai deems businesses like this to be kick-ass and totally worth it for an investment. So if a tower for sale comes across the plate at the right price, they'll buy it. And if not, put your feet back up. This mental model reminds me a lot of how Warren Buffett operates Berkshire Hathaway. He rarely, if ever, puts his feelers out to acquire a company. Most of his acquisitions have come from inbound requests, where management of specific companies want to become a part of the Berkshire family. Warren Buffett waits for businesses to approach him. He will quickly evaluate if he thinks that it's a good investment or not. And then he's famous for basically just giving a handshake to acquire the business, or he quickly moves on. And he goes back to reading his annual reports and sipping Coke in his office. So we want to invest in businesses where the CEO can kick his feet up. We want the CEO to make decisive decisions, but that doesn't mean he needs to make decisions all the time. So now when I'm evaluating businesses, I'm going to simply ask, could the CEO put his feet up on his desk? The final mental model is the possible destinations model. Basically, the possible destinations model helps us think about the future of businesses. So we want to think, what are all of the specific possible destinations where a business could end up 10 or 20 years from now? We're talking worst case scenario, best case scenario, and everything in between. And of course, it's going to be impossible to capture every single scenario for the business, but it puts you in the right frame of mind to start thinking about the negatives as much as the positives for the future of the business. Pabrai gave the example of Costco for this mental model. He said that, I think it was last year, that Costco just opened a store in China, and the store was basically overrun with customers clamoring to get into the store. So if that's the current state of Costco, what does the business look like 20 years from now? Well, one possibility is that Costco has an additional 1,000 stores in China, and it starts to build its presence in many more countries around the world. And by the way, Pabrai thinks that if the DNA and culture of Costco remains intact, he thinks that this is pretty likely to happen. So taking the business from today's circumstances, Costco looks like it has a long and fruitful runway ahead of it. In other words, Pabrai thinks that Costco is a cinch with a great possible destination. However, we do have to evaluate the flip side. So we need to ask, what is a possible destination if Costco does everything wrong from here on out? Well, this is where an understanding of the business is really important. I mean, we could just say, yeah, the business goes out of business. And it's as simple as that. However, what's more likely is we need to consider what happens if Costco doesn't grow anymore or begins to steadily decline. That doesn't mean that it's going to be dead in 20 years or completely disappeared, but there may not be that great overseas expansion, for instance. And, buying a company like that at today's prices is not going to be a great investment, even though the company may still be pretty good in the future. So all in all, we want to focus on if a business is a cinch, if the CEO can put his feet up on his desk, and if the company has a very likely excellent possible destination. As I've discussed before, Pabrai's new goal is to invest in these long-term compounders before the world recognizes them as long-term compounders. And he mentions that it's somewhat of a fool's errand to look for the exception to the rule. But he also states that that's the only way to the promised land. So if we can use these three mental models to help us identify businesses that will be long-term compounders before the rest of the world does, then we're probably going to be in a great situation in the future. So if we add these three mental models to our toolbox, hopefully they'll help us come a long way to being able to identify these long-term compounders before the rest of the world wises up. Okay, and let's quickly go through a few more of my key takeaways where Pabrai gave some practical tips for investors. The first one is regarding balancing learning and knowing the bounds of your circle of competence. Pabrai always says that if you're asking the question, is this in my circle of competence? Then to ask the question is to answer it. So if you're not absolutely sure that you understand a business, then it's definitely not in your circle of competence. So ordinarily, if you don't understand the business, then you should probably just take a pass and move on to another opportunity. However, what happens when we're faced with the situation where we want to really understand more about this business or this sector or whatever? And in this case, Pabrai's advice is basically, if the subject matter excites you, then feel free to do a deep dive. I mean, that's how we go through life pretty much. We continue to learn and learn and learn. And as investors, you could have success to being very concentrated with a very narrow circle of competence. And for a lot of people, that is a great way to make a living. However, for me personally, I like to try to expand my circle as much as possible. To be honest, it's the most fun part about investing is just continually trying to expand that circle. Pabrai talked at lengths about his investment in Frontline, which was a shipping company way back in his early days of investing. And he didn't know much about the shipping industry, but because he went deep into the company and he had some insights that he could pull from other industries such as real estate, he was able to make a pretty large profit on his investment. So if a company is not in your circle of competence, then there's going to be a big risk if you invest in that company because you probably don't know what's going to happen in that industry or with that company in particular. But don't let that stop you from following your curiosity and diving deeper into a business that you really do want to understand. Next, he gave a little insight into his actual research process. He suggests that we go find write-ups in places such as Value Investors Club or SumZero to get a general understanding of what the business does and the investment thesis for it. Now, one of the main reasons for going through the annual reports is to kind of understand how management has been behaving. So management can say many grandiose and lofty ideas 5, 10 years ago, but we want to understand what they were saying about the business 5 or 10 years ago, read the history of what has actually happened and transpired with the business, and figure out where they are today, and if management has been unintentionally deceitful or if they just weren't able to correctly predict the outcome of the business. In the first case, you don't want to invest probably because management is not good. And in the second case, the business doesn't seem like it might be as predictable or have as much of a moat as you might have originally thought 10 years ago. And it's important to mention that Pabrai is looking for the flimsiest reason to stop looking at a company. I mean, he might spend a minute, 30 seconds on a company, and if it keeps intriguing him, he'll go 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and if it keeps intriguing him, he'll spend another couple hours and so on until extending days. And at some point you come to the realization that you really need to dedicate days, if not weeks, to this company. Or, the answer to your dilemma might be very obvious. It really depends on the business, but that's kind of his approach to things. So he looks at the high-level thesis, then will continue to drill further and further, deeper and deeper into the business, looking for disconfirming evidence at every step of the way, so he can stop and go back to being a gentleman of leisure. And there's no wasted efforts in investment research. So at the very least, you're coming away with a better understanding of that specific company or that industry that the business is in or the management of that company. So really, you're always learning, and that's one of the highlights of investing in general. And finally, I want to touch on Pabrai's thoughts about discounted cash flows. And basically, he is not a huge fan of having to run a DCF. He thinks that you get into a dangerous territory when you have to go to an Excel spreadsheet in order to determine if a company is cheap or not. Basically, he said in the past that it should be slapping you in the face with a 2x4 that the company is just outrageously cheap. So before running a DCF or anything like that, it's way more important that we understand the business really well. And if you understand the business really well, then you shouldn't even need a DCF in order to determine if the company is a bargain or not. For example, he said that if he sees Costco selling at 9 times earnings, he doesn't need a spreadsheet to tell him that that company is going to make him a lot of money. I don't think Pabrai is saying that it's wrong to run a DCF, but he's just saying that you can trick yourself with false precision from any spreadsheet output, and it's better to just go based on your understanding the business, and then that should reveal what the value of the company is. I know I've had the urge to run DCFs in the past when I'm trying to convince myself that a company is really cheap. But again, if I do understand the company really well, then I shouldn't need the DCF. But yeah, I understand that it is very tempting because you want to put some tangible value on a company. It's really hard to overcome that. Anyway, run the DCF, don't run the DCF. But I think more importantly, we should heed Pabrai's words that we really need to understand the business really well in order to understand the possible valuation for the company. If you like this video, you may enjoy my video over here where I talk about Mohnish Pabrai's new spawner framework. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date with all my future investing videos. Thank you so much for watching this all the way to the end. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you next time.